Tonight's talk, Zat Hashem, is going to be called Music, Majesty, and Mashiach, the three M's. Rav Moshe Kalbach, Shlita, Hashem should send him a refuah shalema, used to teach here many years ago. I was zeichet to be a Talmud of his way back when, must be over 30 years, around 30 years ago. And Moshe Kalbach used to say that just as we can darshan, we can lidrosh, we can extrapolate, there's exegesis to be done from Lashon HaKodesh and Chazal, and of course from the Torah. So lahavdil, Aleph, Alfei Avdolas, that it may be possible also to be darshan, English. And one of the words he used to darshan was the word coincidence. Coincidence. So we tend to think of coincidence as things just happening coincidentally. He said no, coincidence really is comprised of two words. One of the ways we say, when we say the name, one of Hashem's names is the Yud and the Hey. Now we don't pronounce it like that. We don't pronounce it the way it's spelled. We say Ka or Ka. So coincidence is really Ka, insidence. Hashem moving inside seeming happenstance and coincidence to bring things to their correct appointed time and just coincidentally. I was thinking to myself this afternoon, I was thinking about the shiur tonight, that it cannot be by, or it certainly is by coincidence, if one takes the meaning as we've explained it, that Shavuot this year fell out on the 70th anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's accession to the throne. What's the connection with Shavuot? Because apart from Matan Torah, which of course where we all received two crowns, Hashem, so to speak, sent down, right, the Malachim, Naaseh and Nishma, but also Shavuot is the birthday and the day of the Petirah, the passing of David HaMelech. And David is HaMelech, David Melech Israel. He is the embodiment of kingship. So I wanted to speak a little bit about kingship. There's a bracha that you make when you see a non-Jewish king. It's somewhat different to the bracha that we make. When we see a Jewish king, we say that Hashem has been machalek michvodo, has given a part of his kavod. We talk about a non-Jewish king in similar terms. I didn't actually have time to look up the correct nusach. But there's another very similar bracha which is a little bit different. But it says, the Gemara says that one should always run to see a melech basav Adam, a non-Jewish king, because when Mashiach arrives, you'll see the difference. But certainly we can grasp a little bit of the most distant whisper of Malchus by seeing kings of flesh and blood. And although probably nowadays there are very, very few kings, real kings, in terms of, if you've ever read Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass, off with his head. There are very few nowadays, off with his head kind of kings, which is really the fear of the Malchus, power of life and death. Maybe in Saudi Arabia that still happens in a few places. Certainly Queen Elizabeth hasn't had that power, and I don't think anybody in England has had that power for many years. But nevertheless, there's still the most distant whisper of majesty and kavod and honor. Now I remember, and I don't think I can, because I seem to remember seeing the coronation on television. I don't think it's possible. I must have seen something else. But I have this, one of the most early memories of watching this primitive black and white television, which was basically like this glorified fishbowl with this murky, grey black and white, barely black and white, more so different shades of grey, of this procession, and they were up there in the tifla in the church, backwards and forwards, and the archbishop of this and the archbishop of that, and the pomp and ceremony was just like unbelievable. There's all day, and we sat there glued to this fishbowl. I was thinking, how much in my short life things have really come to a pass now where, the monarchy is struggling to hang on in many places. Is it relevant? Is it too expensive? These are the questions that are being asked now. This was a question that 50 years ago was self-evident. Of course we need it. Rav Wolbe says, that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu created kings for one reason and one reason only, which is that we should have the most distant scintilla, the most distant spark of a spark of a spark of a spark of what it means, the Melech Malchei Amlochim. A concept of Malchus, because why? Because we, on Rosh Hashanah, have to be Mamlich HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so we have to understand what a king is, and therefore kings exist, says Rav Wolbe, merely for this purpose, to give us some kind of dugma, a kind of example of what, of course, on the most distant level, a concept of kingship. And as I said, that kingship has really faded tremendously, even in my short life. And he also says that Hashem relates to us measure for measure, midah keneged midah. When the world, by and large, believed in God, so kings had tremendous amount of power. As, so to speak, mankind in general withdrew and atheism became more and more prevalent, so concomitantly Hashem withdrew the power of the kings, measure for measure, along with the fact that people, because there was now no longer, so to speak, a need to the same, if one can put it like that, for that same dugma, that same comparison, that people should have this example of what the kingdom of the Malchus Shemaim, the kingdom of heaven, was like. And I wanted maybe to discuss a little bit David HaMelech, apart from being David HaMelech, David HaMelech is also Naim Zmiros Yisrael. Naim Zmirot Yisrael, which rather infelicitously can translated in English would be something like the sweet singer of Israel. Somehow it loses something in translation. Naim Zmirot Yisrael. David HaMelech is inextricably linked up with music. David HaMelech, if you remember, was the one who would play his harp to soothe Shaul HaMelech when he was in a state of depression. So I wanted to speak about what is the connection between kingship, between music, and of course Mashiach, because David Melech Yisrael eventually will be Mashiach ben David. That will be the ultimate, the last stop on the line, so to speak, of that particular journey of Klal Yisrael, of Malchus. What is the connection between Malchus, between kingship and music? Now I have to confess at the beginning, I'm not a big fan of Jewish music, as anybody who knows me will tell you. It seems to me it lost its track many years ago, and seems to have been just aping in a not very unoriginal way. Maybe there's some exceptions, but generally, as Max will tell you, I'm not a big fan of Jewish music, and it sounds to me about as Jewish as Led Zeppelin wearing tefillin. There was once a famous music biz manager who said, I'd rather have a second-class original than a first-class impersonation. And I guess if you have to approve of that, then probably Bob Dylan springs to mind. The problem is I mean, on a technical level, I guess Bob Dylan couldn't sing his way out of a paper bag, but it really doesn't matter, because as soon as he opens his mouth, that's Bob Dylan, and you know, it's unique. And being unique is essential if you want to be an artist. Because however good a copy may be, it's a copy. And it'll lack that spark of originality. If you want to know what Jewish music, original Jewish music, really sounded like, the music of the Levium in the Beis HaMikdash, which is really, I guess, that is Jewish music, the music that the Levium played, it probably sounded much like classical music. When the Romans destroyed the Beis HaMikdash and they took the Malchus into captivity, so to speak, they captured the kingship. The four great historical exiles of the Jewish people, the four great kingdoms which have stolen the mantle of royalty from the Jewish people, starting off with Babylon, and then Parasumodai, Persia and Media, and then Greece and then Rome, each one stealing the mantle of kingship one from the other. Rome is that last step on the journey before the kingship returns to the Klal Yisrael. And interestingly enough, the animal connected with the Romans is the pig, the chazir. And one of the understandings of that is that the word chazir is connected to the word to give back, lachzir. So the Roman Empire, or its, as we've discussed in many times here, its current spiritual, if you want to call it spiritual, but certainly cultural heirs, the Western materialistic society that we live in, that is really the Roman world that we live in. If you remember, the Roman Empire became the Christian Holy Roman Empire when Constantine converted to Christianity, and then from Constantine became the Holy Roman Empire, which of course my history master always used to say that, which was neither Holy Roman nor an empire, which became the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Greek Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church, and eventually those great powers gave forth to secular powers. And really we can trace a line all the way from Esau and from Rome, all the way down to the Western materialistic society that we live in. It's one long continuum. And it's that society, the society of Edom, whose sign, whose semel is the chazir, and it's one of the reasons because they will be the ones to be machzir, to return the kingship to Klal Yisrael. They will give it back to us eventually, very soon, with the coming of Mashiach. If you want to know, therefore, and of course what I'm getting to is that along with the kingship, with the crown of kingship, with the power, with the malchus, with the grandeur of the kingship, they also took the music. Because why? As we see, that David HaMelech is the Naim Zmirat Yisrael, and he is the epitome of kingship. So when they captured the kingship, when they burned the Beis HaMikdash, they took the Jewish people into slavery, and they also took the music. And Ramesh Shapiro, I asked him once for a makor for this. He said he saw it in Sforim, so I can't give you an actual makor, but I heard it from his mouth. He said that the root, if you really want to know what the songs of the Levium sounded most like, in our experience, it probably sounded much like classical music. Why? Because classical music came from the church, from the Gregorian chants of the early church. That's the beginning of, so to speak, the Catholic Church, the Eastern Church. These chants that they have were probably stolen along with the kingship, seeing as music is a sign of kingship, it's part of kingship, so clearly, therefore, along with the kingship, they took the music of the kingship, the music of Malchus. Now, it's very interesting because if you've ever heard a Gregorian chant, it's monophonic, meaning it always returns to the root note. For example, it might go something like this: da 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 da. But it'll always go back to the root note. It's always attracted back to what we call in music the tonic note, the root note. In every scale, in every diatonic scale, which has 7 notes, and interesting, there are 7 notes, those 7 notes in the scale parallel the 7 colors of the rainbow and the 7 days of the week. 7 is the number of the natural world, and the most natural form of resolution, of resolving, is to go back to the tonic note, back to the root, as you know, like do, as we call it. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Do is the root note. And that's the beauty of the chant, is that it always goes back. It's this very sort of grounded, it returns to that root note. Return to do. Now, if you look at the development of Western music, you'll see there's an increasingly complex use of harmony, which becomes further and further complicated, but never really loses this sense of returning to the tonic. For example, in the Baroque period, great importance was attached to the mathematical interlacing of melody lines, and this was called counterpoint. If you know anything about J.S. Bach and these people, you'll understand what I mean. The lines interlace, counterpoint, but they always go back to do. In fact, people like Bach were employed by usually very rich patrons, and what they would do, they would be instantly called upon, you know, when their friends would come around and say, okay, you know, J.S., give us a fugue, give us a quick toccata, knock us off a good counterpoint. But, as I said, still the melodic structure always returned to the tonic, returned to do. Now, in the 20th century, we've seen the highest level of technological civilization, and at the same time, the greatest violence and the greatest barbarism that man's ever known. The greatest era of atheism has been the 20th century. And I'd like to suggest that this chaos in the modern worldview, is reflected in the music. During the First World War, 1914 to 18, there was a revolution in music theory, which threw out all the rules of Bach and everybody who'd been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, as I said to you, if you play the notes, all the white notes on a piano, you'll play a diatonic scale. It'll be C. But if you play all of the notes on the piano, 13 of them, 12 notes, excuse me, the 12 notes on the piano, this is called the chromatic scale. And as I said, Western music from earliest times was founded on the diatonic scale, the 7 notes. Not all of the notes are used at the same time. But during World War I, someone called Arnold Schoenberg invented something called the 12-tone scale. Schoenberg decided to use all the notes in the chromatic scale, and after this there was no longer a hierarchy of melodic structure where every note inevitably led back to the tonic, led back to do, to the root note. Now, so to speak, there was no king note. There was no pivotal note. There was no note that, so to speak, all the other notes bent their heads in. In a sense, Schoenberg was saying, all notes are equal. For those of you who remember reading Animal Farm. Some notes are more equal than others, but according to Schoenberg, no. All notes are equal. All of those 12 notes are equal. There's no pivotal note. There is no king. There is no do. There is no one step. That's a reflection of the worldview which says, Chas v'chalila, there is no. Schoenberg, and that's really what he was saying. All notes, nothing is going to bow its head in its submission to a root note, a root cause, a prime cause, a creator. Schoenberg refined his creation and brought it to the perfection, if you want to call it perfection, in the 20s. Now, after Schoenberg, of course, composers became more interested in dissonance than consonance, in disharmony than harmony. So to speak, once Schoenberg had dethroned the rules of diatonic composition, many other composers follow suit with their own compositional styles. The door was open. Anything now basically could be called music, and their methods and their styles, including Schoenberg's, this was all called atonality. Tonality becomes atonality. And theism becomes atheism. Schoenberg actually unleashed a genie on the world. He'd breached the walls of the diatonic scale, and almost everything, as I said, became music. And it's not by coincidence, I believe, that in 1943, when the Germans, the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, were burning an entire nation, composing the darkest cacophony that man could compose, in the world of music, there was somebody called John Cage, who achieved notoriety for what he called his prepared pianos. These were pianos which were modified by jamming all kinds of materials, wood, screws, weather stripping, into the pianos to alter their sound, and then the pianist would go out and just bang the keys randomly. That was music. In other compositions, he used a variety of radios or altered tape recordings, all playing simultaneously, or he attached microphones to human bodies' emotion. Now, his most famous composition, my friends, was a piece called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. A piece for the piano in which the pianist walks up to the piano, flips back his tails, sits down at the piano, opens up the lid, sits there in silence for exactly 4 minutes and 33 seconds, closes the lid, walks off the stage, probably to riotous applause. Art reflects life. Music reflects life. And just as atonality, just as tonality became atonality, so monarchy became anarchy. As I mentioned to you before, this fits in with what we said about Rav Wolbe Zatzal, that as Hashem created kings merely to afford us this most distant idea of what the Melech Malchei Amlochim is concerned, as Melech Malchei Amlochim Kodesh Baruch Hu, to give us some kind of distant glimmer. And as I said, the Rav Wolbe says that when the world basically turned away from Hashem, so the kings lost their power. And in the 20th century, as we say, the kings have now completely, almost totally become constitutional, except for a few places, one of which would be in Saudi Arabia. And it's interesting that that's probably, as mashugar as they are, one of the few places in the world where they are extremely strong in their belief in a God. I'm just pointing that out. Gone, very much so, is the whisper of majesty. And similarly, if you look at the visual arts as well, realism gave way to abstractionism and nihilism. That's one aspect of what I wanted to point out tonight. There's another idea which I want to deal with, which is to do, again, with music and with Malchus. As we said, David HaMelech, his name is Zemiros Yisrael. All music has a scale. A scale comes from the Italian word scala, which means a ladder. A ladder always connects the top with the bottom. There's no ladder in the world that connects the top with the middle. The whole concept of a ladder is to connect two extremities. Yaakov Avinu saw a sulam mutzav arza, the ladder that connects heaven and earth, from the top to the bottom. Now, the scale in terms of the notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol, etc., etc., that's the scale. But if you look at each note in itself is also connecting the top to the bottom. Let me try and explain what I mean. Probably the best way to see it is on an instrument like a string bass. If you pluck a string bass, a large double bass, you'll notice that the string oscillates about a central point. And as far as it goes this way, it goes that way. No string in the world does this. And if you look at an oscilloscope of a tone, you'll see that the wave goes minus, however much, as far as it goes minus, it goes plus, and vice versa. Meaning that, and that's a note. So we see that the air vibrations are positive and negative, so to speak. And you see this clearly on the oscilloscope. Meaning that not only does a scale connect the top and the bottom, but each individual note connects, so to speak, the top and the bottom, the two extremities of its travel. That's what produces the note. So there's a scale which connects top to the bottom, a note which is connected, a connection of top and bottom, and also emotionally. As we said before, David HaMelech would play his harp to soothe the depression of Shaul HaMelech. Music has this incredible power to soothe the savage breast. How does it do this? The Chazal talk about the four humors. The ancients talked about four humors of the body. The humor, quote unquote, the way of expressing emotional states, phlegmatic, sanguine. Depression comes from what's called the mora shchora. Depression, which is also known as the mora shchora, which is black bile depression. The deeper sources say that the source of music is in the mora shchora. The source of music is in depression, which is a kind of strange thing. But if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Music has the ability to draw somebody from depression because it can connect to the very lowest part. It's as though music says, I've been there, I can empathize with you. I can talk to you because my root also is in that depression. And music therefore has the ability to change a person's mood from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top. So we have three aspects of music which connect the top and the bottom. The scale itself, the note, which is comprised of an oscillation of top and bottom, and the emotional correlative of music, which is a connection of top to bottom. We need some chumashim. Do we have chumashim here?
Not really.
We have more than one? Okay, great. Thank you very much. We want to turn to Bereshis 19:25. In the Art Scrolls, Bereshit, Yud Tes, Chaf Hey. I'll find the page and I'll let you know. 19.
Page 88.
88. Thank you very much. Yeah. So, 25. This is the destruction of Sodom Vamora. So it says that Abraham, Hashem Yotza ala Oretz, the sun came out over the land, over the earth, and Lot ba Tzoira. So Lot came to Tzoa. V'Hashem himtir al Sodom v'al Amoira gofris v'eish me'es Hashem min hashamayim. And Hashem rained down on Sodom v'Amora gofris, sulfur and fire from Hashem, from the heavens. Now the next pasuk is the one I want to analyze. V'yahafoch es ha'orim ha'el, and Hashem overturned, Yahafoch es ha'orim ha'el, these cities, Veis kol ha'kikor, and the whole plain, Veis kol yoshvei ha'orim, and all of the inhabitants of the cities, V'tzemach ha'odamah, and the vegetation of the earth. Now, in English literature, we would call the ending of this sentence bathos. Meaning, if you think about it, and Hashem turned over all these cities, and all the plain, and all the dwellers of the cities, and the plants. I mean, it's kind of strange, isn't it, that we've got this big, tremendously, unfortunately, we've all been subject to science fiction movies, and we can. I'm sure the science fiction guys would have a wonderful go at this in their comfortable air-conditioned trailers out there in Southern California, and they come up with these amazing visualizations of such a thing. But what are they going to do? And the plants. I mean, it's very. Look at it again. Vayafoch asa orim ha'el, and Hashem turned over these cities and the plain and all the dwellers and the tzemach and the vegetation. Well, first of all, surely if he turned over the plain, he turned over the vegetation. And second of all, it sounds like we're reaching this crescendo, this tremendous climax, and then it's called bathos. There's a term in English grammar. It's like you pull the rug out. Okay, so what's going on in this pasuk? Obviously, this needs to be understood. Now, where does David HaMelech come from? David HaMelech comes from Sodom. David HaMelech, David Melech Israel. The kingship of Israel comes from an unnatural relationship. David HaMelech comes from Moav. What does the word Moav mean, literally? From father. David HaMelech was the result of an incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. Now, the Torah ascribes no blame because basically the two daughters believed that, I guess in our kind of worldview, we would think of it as like a post-nuclear Holocaust. They thought that was it. There was nobody else left in the world for them to procreate with. And therefore, L'Shem Shemayim, they did what they did. But nevertheless, that's a very, very strange beginning for Melech Israel. Starts in this manner. Along the line, David HaMelech also is the result of what? Yehuda and Tamar. Basically, Yehuda, when he had relations with Tamar, thought that she was a lady of the street. Also a very, very strange place for the king of the David Melech Israel to come from. What's going on here? Moav also is Gematria Memtes, 49. As we said before, 49 is 7 squared. As we said before, 7 is the number of this world. 7 days of the week, 7 colors in the rainbow, 7 notes in the diatonic scale. And if you want to extrapolate something to the maximum that it can possibly be, you times it by itself. 49 is the maximum anything can be in this world. That's why we count 49 days of the Omer. We can't count the 50th day, because 50 is not a number that exists in this world. Of course, there's a number called 50. But what 50 represents is something which is beyond this world. That's Shavuot, that's supernal. And similarly, when Klal Yisrael were in Mitzrayim, they were at the Memtes Share Tuma. And they were right on the threshold of vanishing completely when Hashem pulled us out of their hipazon, suddenly, dramatically. And if we'd stayed there 1 second longer, we would not have come out, because there is no return after the 49th gate, or from the 49th gate. Moav represents all 49 gates of Tumah. And as we know, later on in the story of Klal Yisrael, when we came out of Egypt, the Bnos Moav were machshil, They seduced the Jewish men and caused a tremendous plague and destruction. Bilam. Moab, throughout the history of the Jewish people, has been that element which is always represents immorality, tumah. Mem tes shari tumah. So why does David HaMelech have to come from there? A secular king is entirely different from a Jewish king. A Jewish king is known as Achad Ha'am. In fact, there's a pasuk in the Torah. Achad Ha'am is he's one of the people, one of the nation. Achad Ha'am means he's miyached et ha'am. He unifies the people. A Jewish king has to exemplify. A Jewish king is in person the entire nation of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, in order to be miyached et ha'am, in order to be able to unify the nation, he has to, so to speak, come from the very bottom part. He has to be able to reach and to be in sympathy from the very bottom to the very top. That's why David HaMelech has to start off his genesis, so to speak, has to come from such a low place. Because it's only by coming from the very bottom then he can reach to the very top and unify everything that's in between. Let's go back to our pasuk. David HaMelech, Mashiach, says Mashiach, before Mashiach comes, there will be something called Ichvasa de Mashiach, the birth pangs of Mashiach. And the parable of a birth is absolutely accurate when we talk about the coming of Mashiach. There are two ways that Mashiach can come. Mashiach can come with things gradually getting better and better and better and better and better. Or things can go further and further and further and further and further down until they literally cannot get any worse. And then by a process of what's called hipuch, literally everything flips from the positive to the negative. And everything that's flips on its head. And we go to the top. From the very bottom we go to the top. This is Mashiach, this is David HaMelech. It's called a process of hipuch, sudden reversal. And that's why it's called the birth pangs of Mashiach. Because let's assume that you are a Martian and you have this very strong telescope. Now, being a Martian, you have no idea, because of course, as we know, Martians are single-cell, self-replicating organisms. They have no parents. They have no idea of children. They just self-replicate. So you've no idea what a human birth looks like. And you have this, as I say, super duper, super large telescope, and you've trained your telescope on the delivery rooms in Hadassah in Karen. And you see this poor earthling woman writhing around in this most terrible agony. And everybody's standing around with their white coats on, and nobody seems to be doing anything for her. And you think, well, why, this poor thing, why don't they do something for her? And in a split second, everything turns from complete disaster and tragedy. In a second, it's a hipuch to the greatest joy. That is why Mashiach is referred to as the birth pangs of Mashiach. Because just as in a birth, everything seems to be the most desperate situation, and in a second it's flipped on its head to become the greatest joy. Similarly with Mashiach, when Mashiach comes, the greatest sadness and all the terrible things that we have no idea why they're going on in the world, and the tragedies, and Hashem Yerachim, will suddenly in a split second, everything will go whoop, flipped on its head. Mashiach is known as the Tzemach Tzedek. Doesn't translate very well. Tzemach means a sprout. tzedek means righteous. But his name will be Tzemach. Es Avdi Tzemach. It says in the Navi. Now, if you look at this pasuk, you'll be able to make much more sense of it. Yud Tes, right? No, sorry. Chaf Hei. V'yahafoch. Remember where we are. We're in Sodom. And Hashem, Yahafoch, He flipped the Orim, the cities, these cities, and all the plain, and all the dwellers of the plain, and the Tzemach Ha'adamah. We're not talking about vegetation here. This is a hint that the coming of Mashiach, how everything will be flipped on its head. When David HaMelech, who is the Naim Zmiris Yisrael, who carries within him the music of kingship, the music that was stolen by the Romans, who carries within him that secret of the music which is a connection of the top to the bottom, both in the scale and the note and the emotion. That's all carried within it, because that is what a king is. A king contains within him the top to the bottom. And it's only through that Mashiach Tzidkenu, who should come very soon, will be able to turn the world on its head, and the great sadness that we see in front of us, and all the tragedy and all the wrong, will in a split second be reversed. It should come very, very soon. B'meiri Yomeinu.